My Bear cargo van, as new as all are uninsulated and don't even have really dampening on many of the metal walls. You can see here in some of the photos that the bare metal walls have these painted blue rubberized strips, are basically like a Neuco deadening map that's comes from the factory on some of the panels, but not all. And so you definitely get some vibration as you're driving down the road through these metal panels. So the first thing I did is went ahead and I applied Neuco deadening mat as per the instructions, covering about a quarter to a third of the panel. And I applied that to all the panels that didn't have this factory deadening mat already installed, including even the smaller ones and also the ceiling panels and even the wheel wells. And I found that that alone made a really significant improvement on, call it the rumbling or vibration of the walls when driving down the road. I also applied these deadening mats to the slider door panels, the front door panels, and the rear door panels also to ensure that that helped quiet it down. You can see here also a black paint at the bottom cavity of these wall panels. And I went ahead and sprayed a rubberized rust inhibitor paint to the bottom of the wall cavities just for extra assurance that any water or anything else got in those wall cavities was certainly well prevented from rusting. Before going on to the next step and actually applying insulation to the wall cavities, I also put a silicone caulk around the little clips that hold the door and wall trim panels on, just to make sure that no water could leak in through those. You'll see in some of these photos blue painter's tape on the floor. That was actually painter's tape laid out on the floor in the exact locations and dimensions of my floor cabinets as they were planned, so I could get a sense for the space and feel for where those would be and how they would, the space between them. That definitely is a suggestion I would make to help you with your cabinet layout before you go and make those cabinets. You'll also see some blue painter's tape sometimes holding up the thin slate insulation as it's applied in the walls, and that was really when I had extra layers that I added that were not really adhered to the wall panel, and so just to make sure to hold those up. You'll also see some measuring tape, and that's in yellow or white, and that's actually essentially masking tape with dimensions already printed on it. And I lay these out very carefully from certain locations as starting points and took really accurate and detailed photos of those locations, and also where they intersected with all of the wall structural ribs and ceiling ribs, so that I knew where these were from a certain measured point once I put the wall panels on, so I could actually drill to mount the wall panels directly to the structural ribs and ensure I wasn't just going into the thin wall cavity or the absence of any structure into just the wall cavity. In addition to the Neuco sound deadening mats that I added to all the different open wall panels, I also added some Neuco adhesive sound deadening liner, which is basically also includes a softer foam covered with a reflective metallic liner across really all the floor portions of the seat bases, up the firewall, and also in through the headliner and the entire ceiling of all the open panels in the ceiling, as you can see here. And that certainly helped to cut back noise and provide additional thermal insulation as well. After the sound deadening mats were placed, I also adhered in some 3M Thinsulate 600, it's roughly about 1.5 inch thick. I adhered this to the walls after stuffing it through every single one of the different structural wall cavities, cutting it to size for each of the open and also the enclosed wall cavities. And here that was some simple spray-on adhesive spray. In some of those wall cavities, they were actually deep enough that I could add a second layer of the thin slate. The thin slate is fantastic. It is made for vehicles, and it works very well for both sound deadening as well as thermal insulation. I added the Thinsulate into the door panels, the front doors, the slider door, and the rear doors after adding the sound deadening mats and some additional foam reflective insulation in certain little cubbies. And I certainly pulled this Thinsulate all the way through all the different cavities, including around the windows and the rear doors and the slider doors, which is challenging to pull through, but it definitely adds a lot of benefit, and sometimes you can pull even multiple strips through for multiple layers. I also added it into and through the D pillars at the rear of the van and also the B pillars at the front of the van. A little side note on this is there's a lot of road noise that does come in through these B-pillars, and they are very thick and protrude out with a lot of metal, so they transfer a lot of heat and road noise into the van, particularly because they're right behind the passenger and driver's seat. There is on the Mercedes Sprinter some foam caps on the underneath the van that you can remove, and they just simply pull out and push back in under with a friction fit. And once you remove those, there is a massive cavity there that is big enough to put in an air compressor or other things that you could put inside there that are sizable. But you can definitely also stuff that with the Thinsulate or some other insulation, and that adds a lot of additional thermal and noise reduction. Once the Thinsulate was fully installed in the walls and stuffed down those lower cavities of the walls and through all the different sections in the doors, I also added some low E reflective foam core insulation. This is 72 inches wide, which could cover almost the entire height of the van. And I ran it all the way from the front of the van down to the back of the van, and then added another section to cover the lower or the upper section on the walls. I then also taped that, sealed it completely with foil tape. So it really sealed in the outside from the inside, and so that any temperature and humidity, things like that, that gets generated in the inside of the van stay in the inside of the van and don't transfer through to the outside. This created quite a phenomenal insulated barrier. I also did the same thing in the ceiling after adhering Thinsulate into all the ceiling cavities, and it has worked tremendously well. One thing to note is that I chose not to put any electrical or water lines through my walls. And the reason why is because I wanted them both outside where I could access them if I ever needed to for any kind of an issue that might come up in the future, to make sure also that things like water lines were in the insulated space, not in the wall cavity where it was cold, and they could potentially freeze or create a leak that would be very difficult to ever get to. And also just so I knew exactly where they were, so I never put a screw into one of them and causing some electrical short or a leak later on. I covered my walls with 1/4 inch expanded PVC foam, which is fantastic because it is self-extinguishing, it's flexible, it's light, it's strong, it really does hold screws well, will not absorb any water or odors. It's also easy to cut. It doesn't create any sawdust when you're cutting or drilling into. It has zero thermal transfer, and it takes very few screws to hold it up. It also is much lighter than plywood, and it also could come in very wide widths. I use actually a 60-inch width, which could bridge the 50+ inch wall cavity spaces that are in the Mercedes Sprinter. So I only had to use 5 total sheets or pieces of this instead of actually 13 different pieces of plywood as often used to fill in all the different wall cavities, because the plywood can only come in 48-inch widths, and so it isn't wide enough to span those larger Mercedes Sprinter wall cavities, which are also similar on other vans. For the floor, I bought 3/8 inch mini cell, which has no fire spread. It's hydrophobic. It provides good sound deadening and very minimal amount of cushion, as it's pretty dense. It does provide some insulation, not quite enough, so I went ahead and doubled this up. I cut it into small sections, into angles to match up with the ribs, both in width as well as their angles as they protruded up from the floor of the van, and then took a full sheet once all those were covered over and laid it completely over all the ribs. So there is at least 3/4 of an inch in the troughs and 3/8 of an inch in the other sections. I cut out little holes that lined up with the floor mounts, to anchor mounts, the factory floor anchor mounts, to make sure that I could attach my cabinets into those. Before covering over the mini cell with the factory subfloor that came with the van, I went ahead and there's a little gap that runs from left to right of the van, or across the width of the van, that is recessed down, and it happens to be recessed enough once this mini cell was added to accommodate my 3/4 inch outside diameter, 1/2 inch interior diameter water pipe, so I could run hot and cold water across the van, inside the van. I could run my 30 amp shore power AC connection, as well as a second 30 amp connection to run over to the other side of the van for those circuits. I could also run my AC circuits that were on the other side of the van, and also some other electrical wires, including some spare wires, which have been excellent for future accommodations. And then the subfloor actually went over all this, both protecting these wires and tubing, but also having them on the interior of the van to make sure they don't freeze, and so I can continue to use my water system even as I have all the way down to -5 degrees Fahrenheit. Before finishing up the floor insulation, I made sure that I also put the Noico sound deadening mats on the wheel wells. That definitely cuts down noise from those, and completely cover those over with an adhesive foam, insulative and sound deadening foam. And then also these rubberized wheel well cover mats that I ended up buying from Terrawagon, which are excellent from a durability and also extra both thermal and sound noise insulation. I also only use the factory tie-down bolts to hold the factory subfloor as it was held, and also that is what I've used to hold that on my cabinets. I have not drilled into the floor at all for mounting anything whatsoever, and so I've kept the floor structural integrity, as well as not preventing any potential for rust or other issues with the floor by not drilling through it for any kind of mounting points. I should also note that I don't have any penetrations that go through the exterior wall other than for the windows. My only penetration for the shore power connection is down in the seal, so it comes in below the van, and then those wires pass up through a small hole in the floor. And the same, of course, for the hoses for the water pipes or water connections I have underneath the floor. So I don't have any thermal transfer from the wall or floor or ceilings to the inside of the van. In the cab, I added some UXCEL, UXCEL 10mm heat and sound deadening insulation mat that's a self-adhesive applied to all the rounded areas that are difficult to add other insulation to. I also added some Shine Home sound deadener with a reflective liner into the cab base and walls. Also added that to the inside of the doors where I could, and added some reflective foam in the headliner and doors where possible. In regards to the floor, where I did make a hole cut to pass wires through, you can see the profile of the different insulation in the subfloor here. For removing the factory headliner and before placing it, I certainly pulled Thinsulate through all the different little structural components within the headliner area. Also did put an adhesive foam, sound deadening, and reflective mat into the whole headliner area because of its rounded shape. It was easy to attach that and really sealed up, so it's very well sealed. I also added probably as much as 3 layers of Thinsulate because there's a lot of spare room in the cavities and on the side of the headliner. And I did all this, of course, after already making some connections for wires. There's a couple different grounding studs, factory grounding studs up there for negative wires. And there's some wires that I passed through in the headliner and so forth that I already pulled through in different areas and create a little bit of a wire chase through a reflective foam mat rolled up. So they had like a conduit to pull those wires, but it was also insulative as well. In my next video, I'm going to go into not only how I finished the floor, but also the ceiling, and embedded the lights within that reflective ceiling, and then of course also how I finished the walls. So I appreciate you subscribing and watching, and look forward to sharing more with you in my next video.